All right, what's going on, guys? The main thing I want to talk about today is necromancy and this idea that I keep hearing that is necromancy still overpowered? Is necromancy bad for the game? To be clear, I think these are two different questions that have two different answers. I think that this answer is relatively complicated, and in all honesty, most people that talk about this don't address it with the level of nuance that you need to have a full understanding of necromancy. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this idea of power budget. Now, in game design, a power budget refers to the notion that everything that the player gets to do in a game, so in a game like RuneScape, that's going to mean your weapons and your style choice. In a game like League of Legends, it's what character you're playing and what items you're building. In a game like Warframe, which is another game I play, that's going to be, okay, every character is supposed to be Exodia, but are certain characters invalidating other characters because they're doing it so much better? These are the types of things that we talk about when we talk about power budgeting, and that every good thing a character does usually has to come at some cost. To give an example of a thing in RuneScape with poor power budgeting, we can look at Magic before the Fracture Staff change. Now, before the Fracture Staff change, two different magic abilities needed to be nerfed because they let Fracture Staff basically go infinite. Where Magma Tempest being able to crit means that you can press one ability for 9 hit spots that can crit. And then with Onslaught, every hit being a guaranteed crit, you could just full channel an Onslaught, and if you were allowed to just stand there, you just did an arbitrary amount of damage for 30 seconds. These two things need to be nerfed because of Fractured Staff, but then beyond that, the Fractured Staff before its change did everything. So Crypt Bloom at the time was significantly tankier because it reduced typeless damage and just reduced a little bit more damage in general. So Crypt Bloom is significantly tankier, and if you switch to Blood Barrage during your Fractured Staff, not only were you doing the most damage because of the recursive crits and you just did your Armadillo Battle Staff spam, you also were invincible. If a boss could not one-hit you, switching to Blood Barrage meant you could not die. Your health bar turned into a binary. Your health was either full or it was empty, and the vast majority of bosses can never really bring you to empty. So Magic had the most damage because at the time we didn't have Dracolith. Magic was the tankiest. Magic also had the most sustain, so it had the most access to lifesteal tanking. And it was relatively simple. Obviously, you could 4-tick, but you didn't have to. You could just spam Armadillo Battle Staff and you'd get 90% effectiveness, which is incredibly potent. The only real cost, if you can even call it that, was that the runes were incredibly expensive, but you were making more money by using Magic than you were if you were just using the other styles. So in reality, that extra cost was just made back by you getting better drops. An example of decent power budgeting, I say decent because I think melee should be a little bit stronger than it is right now, but an example of decent power budgeting is current melee, where current melee is the second most damage in the game. It pays for this damage by being squishier. Its armor is a piece of paper. By being squishier because Berserk makes you take more damage, and by being in the melee range, right? There's a lot of bosses that either punish you for being in melee range or they just move around a lot. So these things mean that melee has to pay quite a bit in order to actually get access to how much damage it does. Now, melee does have a little bit of utility in that it has one more stun than all of the other classes. Melee having access to Barge is not only a cleanse, but it's a targeted stun, which is very, very good. And it's also just mobility in general. So being a little bit more mobile, having a little bit more CC, being a little bit more survivable in terms of its interaction with crowd control means it's, it should have a little bit less power, but you take so much more damage with melee that, in my opinion, melee should probably get a little bit more in terms of damage or even more in terms of utility, given that it does the second most damage. So I'll just be an example of a style that is more appropriately budgeted. Now we'll talk about the rest of the styles. So ranged has the high sustained damage of the game. It's not close. Ranged also has even more damage against poisonable bosses. Big arrows against poison bosses are broken. Like, there's no other word for it. They're completely insanely overpowered at poison bosses. However, ranged has a very little utility. Basically, all of ranged utility is more damage. You're either getting more damage from your arrow type, you're getting more damage from a ruby bolt switch, you're getting more adrenaline, which turns into more damage from death spore arrows or hydrix bolts. You do get more sustain from onyx bolts, but no one really uses those right now. So range has effectively zero utility, and ranged also has to give up sustain in order to get access to split soul. I don't think that last point is as relevant, given that ranged has access to a Blood Reaver, which not only does it double dip in the poison damage that we already know is really good, but Blood Reaver heals you, so the fact that range gives up sustain just doesn't matter at all, which means that Split Soul is effectively free anywhere you're using a Blood Reaver. Melee, we already talked about a lot of its pros and cons. Melee also has the highest burst damage, so if you need to do a certain amount of damage in a very condensed period, Melee typically gets to do it the best. Magic has more variance in its damage because of the resetting nature of the new tier 95s, but in general, Magic has slightly more damage than Necromancy. Magic is also extremely tanky with Crit Bloom and Anime Dead. Crit Bloom and Anime Dead are going to be tankier than Dodge Chance depending on the type of content you're doing. So Crit Bloom and Anime Dead are going to be tankier against lots of small hits, whereas Dodge Chance is going to be tankier against slow big hits. But Magic is extremely tanky with Crit Bloom and Anime Dead, and it has significant utility through its spell books and its on-hit effects. For instance, Ice Barrage, if you 4-tick with it, or you just auto-attack once with Ice Barrage, that's a root. That can be pretty potent for CCing certain units. Now, I will say that a lot of Magic's utility is accessed by all of the styles, but you do need to have a high Magic level in order to use that utility. So I still think it's fair to give that as points to Magic, where you can't not use Magic at all and still have access to Prism of Restoration, still have access to Vengeance, still have access to Disruptor Shield. Now, Necromancy currently has the lowest damage in the game, but Necromancy has inherent sustain. It has access to Dodge Chant, which, to be clear, Dodge Chant is also available to every other style, so that's not really the biggest selling point, but it is worth keeping in mind. Necromancy gets significant free damage, meaning that Necromancy doesn't have to work for a lot of its damage. A lot of its damage just happens because of the conjures, and Necromancy is significantly easier to use than all the other styles. Now, one of the big points that people attack about Necromancy is that because it's so much easier, even if it isn't the highest damage, it's still overpowered. There is kind of merit to that in a more general sense. I'm not sure this applies to RuneScape, but in a general sense, ease of use is a balancing lever in the sense that something that is really easy to use means that more players get access to something that's effective, right? If you're quote unquote bad at the game, you can get a lot more out of Necromancy. You can do a lot more content with Necromancy than you can with other styles, assuming the effort you're putting in is exactly the same. This is usually offset by it's very limited in what it can do. So in other games, in a League of Legends, a character like Garen, who all he can do is run at you and then do a bunch of damage. He doesn't have any crowd control. He doesn't have any dashes. So if you're a highly mobile character, or if you're a character that can get Garen off you, it doesn't really matter that Garen is strong or was strong. He's not very good right now. But it doesn't matter that Garen is strong because him being so one-dimensional means that he can't actually do the thing he wants to do. He is non-functional if you have the proper counterplay. What harder styles get access to is a higher skill ceiling, meaning that even if certain things have counterplay, you're able to partially adapt for that counterplay, right? So if there is a boss that is immune to certain attacks, or if there is a boss that, certain types of mechanics are really good against them, typically the other styles just have more things to do. Whereas Necromancy, for instance, in the last phase of Zamorak in phase 7, you're not standing in the perfect exact square. Your skulls will just kill you. It'll bounce off of the B rune and it'll just kill you and you'll die instantly. That's not really something the other styles have to worry about. Like, skulls has to work a certain way. There's also, you know, in not really a bossing sense, but in Slayer, Skulls didn't used to pick up aggro, but now it does. So the fact that Skulls picks up aggro means you don't get to do free damage to everything in the room. All of those things have to attack you now. That means that Necromancy is a lot more risky in AoE scenarios, right? And there's not a whole lot you can do about that. The same is also true of Bloat. When a bloated enemy dies, it spreads the dot to every enemy within 1 square. If there are enemies that are near you that aren't hitting you, if they get bloated by the death effect, they will instantly aggro on you. That's just another example of, okay, because this is so simple, there are drawbacks that you don't really have counterplay for. Now, the flip side of this is if something is so easy that you can ignore or invalidate mechanics, that is poor design, and that is something that should be looked at. It doesn't necessarily mean that the thing is broken, but it means that, or it doesn't necessarily mean that the thing is overpowered, but it means that something isn't working here, right? Like, if we look at a game like Call of Duty, if the strongest gun in the game does, 20% more damage than the second strongest gun in the game, but the second strongest gun has auto aim, it kind of doesn't matter that it's worse, right? Because you just invalidate so many of the game's mechanics by this other mechanic that's on the gun. So how does all of this apply to RuneScape? Necro's ease of use has 4 aspects to it. Necro gets to do its damage without spending adrenaline. Well, it gets to do some of its damage without spending adrenaline. Necro gets a lot of free damage through its conjures. Necro has inherent sustain, meaning that Split Soul is effectively costless in the same way that range can just use a Blood Reaver. Necro has an in-house way of just not really caring that much about the fact that, you have to give up sustain from Split Soul. And Necro is streamlined. Now, to be clear, I think Necro being super streamlined is more of a downside of the other styles rather than Necro being exceptionally easy. While Necro is easier, it's because you only have so many things you're actually allowed to do with Necromancy, right? Like, you can build stacks, build adrenaline for your ultimates, and bloat, or spend stacks. It's basically it. There's not a whole lot else you can do. The other styles have significantly more special attack weapons, have significantly more abilities that are just do damage with some other tacked on thing that usually doesn't matter. Because all of Necromancy's abilities have a very specific niche, they either do a specific thing or give you adrenaline. Necromancy, it's a lot harder to mess up because it's really clear what you should be doing, right? The living death rotation that we use today, that just makes sense. Like, Skulls is your strongest ability, so, and in order to get 3 Skulls out, Skulls needs to be your second ability after living death. So how you actually do a living death rotation is pretty much set in stone, right? You living death, you use any generator. It doesn't even have to be Touch of Death, although it should be, especially because Touch of Death gets reset. You use an adrenaline pot and Skulls on the next ability, and then you just build up to 60, spend whatever resources you have, Skulls off cooldown, rinse and repeat. This is not the same of how the other styles work. The other styles have way more moving parts, and it's not obvious what order you're supposed to use abilities in. It's not obvious which abilities are even good. Like, obviously your greater abilities are good, but when should I use Havoc over, Decimate? When should I use Decimate over Sever? When should I use Slice? Should I even use Slice, right? These are all things that are incredibly unclear, especially when you're trying to learn the style. And that is one of the issues with the other styles. It's not so much that Necromancy is just so mind-numbingly easy that even a caveman could do it. It's more that I can't look at all of my abilities and just know what I'm supposed to be doing. Even looking up a rotation guide for the other styles, it's not always clear why people are doing the stuff they're doing. If I explain a living death rotation to you guys, it's like, oh, that makes sense. Like, it's very intuitive how it works. It's not true of the other styles. So keeping in mind all the things that make Necromancy easy, one of the big downsides of this, or the unintended consequences of this, is that Necromancy invalidates a lot of mechanics that the other styles have to deal with. So, for instance, the other styles have to soul split flick at a lot of bosses because they don't have the inherent sustain to just tank the boss. This is not true with Necromancy. Necromancy does not have to soul split flip Raksha. It does not have to soul split flip Karapak. And I'm sure there's other examples I could think of, but those are two big ones where the inherent sustain plus dodge chance means that you can play way more lazy with Necro than the other styles. To be clear, this doesn't mean that Necromancy is overpowered, but it is concerning because a lot of the ways that we would mitigate damage with the other styles, we just don't have to do with Necromancy, which means that you can use that mental bandwidth for other stuff. Now, just because you have mental bandwidth doesn't necessarily mean you can do much with it because, again, Necromancy is very simple, doesn't have a high skill ceiling. Just because you have more mental, space to focus on what you're doing doesn't mean that, oh, because I have this space, I'm getting 40% more damage out. It means that, oh, I'm probably not making as many mistakes. Which, to be clear, is an upside, that is a benefit, but it's not the same type of benefit as, oh, by mastering what this boss does, I can focus on getting, 100,000 more damage over the course of 30 seconds. That is something you can do with the other styles. It's not something you can really do in Necromancy. Now, to be clear, this is bad, right? You don't want certain things to invalidate certain mechanics, and that's true. The issue is, and I think the main reason that Necromancy isn't overpowered, is that Necromancy does cheat in a lot of ways, in the sense that Necromancy invalidates other mechanics through stuff inherent to Necromancy. So you invalidate a lot of damage with dodge, chance, and sustain. The fact that you have split soul and that your natural sustain means that split soul isn't a real cost. That is strong, but the other styles invalidate those mechanics by just doing more damage, right? So melee, for instance, when you're doing proper rotations, Karapak doesn't really ever get to hit you because you just blow him up at the beginning of each phase, right? Like, my melee kills aren't that good, but when I do melee, he does his rift, and by the time he goes to do his melee slams, he's almost phased already. That's pretty good, and that's not something that you can really do with Necromancy. Even if you're going crazy with the DPS on Necromancy, you still have to do a couple of melee slams, because your cooldowns are so much longer with Living Death. It does mean that mismanagement of those cooldowns means that you do 0 damage. The other thing too is that because Necro's damage is so structured, you typically have to do a lot of waiting around in order for your damage to come back up, because you only have so many things that do really high damage. When we talk about pool skips at Necromancy, you usually need to build up all of your stacks, meaning that the Living Death rotation you do has to skip out on damage in order to make sure you're building residual souls. And then you also have to wait for your split soul to come back up, because it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to do a pool skip without split soul, right? This is not true of melee, and it's not true of range. It's not really true of magic. Magic, again, there's a lot of variance to your kills, but with melee, for instance, yeah, you have to wait for Berserk, but you're Zerking before you go into the kill, and you have a way of reducing your Zerk's cooldown. So the big bottleneck isn't actually, I need to wait here for my Berserk to come back up. It's usually, okay, do I actually have enough adrenaline to Berserk as soon as phase 3 starts? Usually, if you're waiting around in melee at Raksha, it's because, oh, I killed it so fast, I don't have enough adrenaline to instantly Zerk at the beginning of phase 3. So yes, Necromancy does get to do things where Necromancy gets to skip certain mechanics because it has certain aspects of it that let you do that, but the other styles can just blow the boss up and skip the mechanics that way, right? Like, yes, Deathmark at Virago, so pushing at Virago with Necromancy is easier in the sense that Deathmark is always an extra square of push, but melee can just kind of one-hit Virago, where Virago never really gets to fight back, especially on like Purple Bomb, for instance. So for Green Bomb, he will always instantly phase whenever it hits you. And then Vitalis is just tough in general for melee, because like your AoE isn't that scary. But depending on how good your rotation is, you can just do all of your push right at the beginning before Virago ever gets to fight back, and then you just kill him. Range can probably do the same thing. I haven't done Virago with range, so I don't know for sure. But it wouldn't surprise me if range could do the same thing, where as soon as the fight starts, you just Living Death and then just blow Virago up and he doesn't get to play the game. Is that better or worse than, oh, I have to death mark him twice so that I can get a bunch more push? I'm just unconvinced that the things that Necromancy does is so strong that even though the other styles do more damage and can get the mechanic skips that Necromancy does through sheer damage, I'm unconvinced that Necromancy is overpowered despite that. Now, all of that said, there are things about Necromancy that are concerning. So, Necromancy sustain is extremely high, which means that certain types of bosses literally can't kill you. God Wars 1, you cannot die, which is fine. It's God Wars 1, but still, you can't die. No potions, no prayer. You're getting up from your computer. You go take a shower. You come back. You're still alive at full HP. That's just true. God Wars 2, that's kind of true depending on the type of boss you're doing. I believe Greg can still kill you and Twin Furies can kill you, but Hellweir's never killing you. While like you can die from the pools, especially if multiple pools spawn on top of you. If only one pool spawns on top of you, you're never dying to Hellweir. You're never dying to Vindicta. And this is the same reason why something like Anime Dead actually got nerfed. Anime Dead got nerfed for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that you could just go to Hellweir AFK on top of 3 pools and Hellweir cannot kill you. That probably shouldn't be a thing, given that for all the other styles, the pools do like 300 damage a tick. So the fact that you could reduce that 900 damage a tick to like 300 damage a tick, and then Hellweir's bleeds, you reduce that to almost 0, that's pretty concerning. So that's why that ended up getting nerfed. All of this is to say that Necromancy invalidating certain things is bad, and those things should be addressed, but I'm not convinced that's Necromancy's fault. So earlier I said that you don't have to Soul Split Flick Raksha or Karapak anymore. Well, this can be fixed by either removing their accuracy checks or by just increasing how much damage they do. All of a sudden, it doesn't matter anymore that Necromancy can't Soul Split Flick. And then the way that you can fix that on the back end is you make Protection Prayers a little bit more effective, right? Like, we'll say we'll increase Rax's damage by 20%, but make Protection Prayers effective by the same amount. So that, okay, if you are Soul Split Flicking, taking the same amount of damage, if you're not Soul Split Flicking, you're going to die every single time. The same thing can happen at Karapak, where for phases 1 through 3, you don't have to Soul Split Flick at all. Maybe during those phases, Karapak, in hard mode, he does an extra hit, and that's 50% damage. All of a sudden, you can't really just abuse the fact that, hey, with Ghost, I'm invincible. That's not really a thing anymore. These are the types of balance changes that I like to see, or alternatively, you could just reduce Necromancy sustain even more. I'm not convinced that's necessary because RuneScape doesn't really have a drain tank. So Necromancy being the drain tank style is fine. But if a drain tanking means that you're invincible, that's a problem, right? Again, that's why we nerfed the Fractured Staff. Keeping all that in mind, I think it's fair to say that Necromancy is problematic, but not in the way that a lot of people say it is. Does Necromancy make it so that, oh, I'm invincible at certain bosses? Yes, it does. Does Necromancy make it so that you can, cheat certain mechanics of certain bosses through Deathmark? Yes. However, it also pays for that by doing the least damage, and it pays for that by having the least flexibility of any other styles. Where if a boss were to come out that was, immune to damage under 2000, like the second challenge at Zuck, if there was a boss that was just its passive, all of a sudden Necromancy is way worse. Like, it's unusable at that boss. I would argue it's non-functional because now the free damage you get from your conjures, they don't do any damage. I hope this was a clear explanation of why Necromancy isn't overpowered from a game design perspective. Now, as I said, it does have issues, and I do think that some things need to be changed to accommodate for the way that Necromancy exists in the game. Personally, I like to see bosses either be a little bit tankier so that the other styles having more damage is that much more meaningful, or I'd like to see the bosses do more damage to us so that you can't just sit there with your Ghost and Soul Split on and never have to worry about dying. Unironically, a boss like Vorkath is actually a pretty good test for Necromancy in the sense that Necromancy doesn't perform as well there because you just, you need to be able to play super well, especially if you're soloing. You need to be able to do a bunch of damage in order to get yourself out of certain mechanics. And Necromancy just can't do that. So Necromancy has to deal with a lot more at Vorkath than the other styles do, right? Like, range just obliterates Vorkath. That's not close. So range gets to skip a lot of the mechanics by just doing so much damage that Vorkath can't play the game. To me, that sounds pretty overpowered, but that's not what Reddit said. But yeah, that's gonna be it for this video. Hopefully this either changed your mind on some things or explained clearly why I personally don't think that Necromancy is overpowered. As more of these topics come up, I'll post more discussion videos about them. But yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.